verdict of the jury is that Mr. Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo died from the effects of a poison, antimony, but that there is not sufficient evidence under what circumstances it came into his body. I am sure you would wish me to convey to Mrs. Bravo our thanks for inviting us to conduct this inquest at the Priory. And thank you, gentlemen, for your attendance.
Oh, yes. I knew Mrs. Bravo before her marriage for a good many years. We were on terms of great affection.
But you did not know Mr. Bravo, I understand.
To the best of my knowledge, I've never seen him. I'm afraid there's little I can tell you. Have you been briefed by someone in this sad affair?
My dear Gully, I have called upon you as a friend.
Oh, my dear fellow, I didn't mean that, but you barristers are such busy fellows. I do not expect you to waste your time on idle questions. Not that anyone in England seems able to avoid the Bravo mystery. Rumors and speculation in the press. Questions in Parliament.
Did you know the police had ransacked the Priory and taken away every bottle in the house?
Yes.
They're searching for traces of antimony. You saw the Telegraph of yesterday.
No, I only read the Times.
Oh, there was this letter. Sir, your correspondent, Mr. Doughty, has evidently overlooked the fact that tartar emetic is extensively used in veterinary medicine. Where several horses are kept, it is by no means unusual to find 2 or 3 ounces of tartarized antimony in the stable medicine chest. And since Mr. Bravo kept several horses, it is quite possible that this preparation may have been on his premises for perfectly legitimate use. Now, up until the time of her marriage, Mrs. Bravo's coachman was a man named Griffiths, the same George Griffiths who was your coachman for many years before.
I see. You came to warn me.
Now, while you employed him, did Griffiths ever use tartar emetic?
He may have done. He knew I was opposed to drugging, but very likely he paid small heed to that. Surely I shall not be involved because my coachman...
Just how would you answer if the police should question you about your previous relationship with Mrs. Bravo?
I should defend her reputation.
And your own? Oh, my dear Gully, you must understand. The Treasury solicitor has been instructed to take statements. That inquest under Carter was a fiasco. If new facts come to light, I believe steps could be taken in the High Court to create a fresh inquiry.
A second inquest?
Now, just imagine what a feast the press would make of that.
Scandal and rumor, my dear Perry. Neither I nor Mrs. Bravo would seek to draw attention to our former friendship.
No, but events may force her. Mr. Joseph Bravo is a wealthy man. He has engaged himself publicly to clear his stepson's name of any taint of suicide. The alternative to that is murder. Mrs. Bravo's father also is a wealthy man, and he will defend her by every means within his power. So we have 2 powerful families in conflict, each requiring to prove their case. Why should Charles Bravo have been murdered or else committed suicide? And there's only one motive that will suit them both.
Jealousy. Mine or his?
My dear Gully, you must protect yourself. My advice is to stay quiet and trust that Mrs. Bravo will do the same. It's now in the hands of the Treasury solicitor.
When I was 19 years old, I married Captain Alexander Ricardo of the Grenadier Guards, who died at Cologne on the 19th of April, 1871. In the spring of that year, at the instance of my mother, I went to Malvern to be under the care of Dr. Gully. Dr. Gully took a great and increasing interest in my welfare, and I became attached to him and grateful for his care of me. He resided near me, having given up his practice at Malvern in the year 1871. In the autumn of 1875, I casually met Mr. Charles Bravo, having been introduced to him some months before by Mrs. Cox, and we were married on the 7th of December, 1875. My income was then about £3,000 a year. He was pressing me to put down my garden and my cobs, my 2 great hobbies, and to turn away Mrs. Cox. I used to ask him why this was necessary. He told me he had kept a woman before marriage at Maidenhead and owed her or her sister £500, of which last fact I was ignorant till after his death. He was a very passionate man and short-tempered. And I got quite to like him and forgot his meanness, which had previously disgusted me. A compact between us before marriage was that Dr. Gully's name should never be mentioned, as nothing improper had ever passed between us. But although I never saw or spoke of Dr. Gully, he was continually, morning, noon, and night, abusing him and upbraiding me for my former acquaintance with him. On Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, I fell asleep almost directly. The next thing I remember was being awakened by my maid. She said he was ill. I got up immediately and went to my husband. He was lying by the window, unconscious, in the spare room. I said loudly to Mary Ann and Mrs. Cox, "I am afraid he has eaten something bad." He was so sick, I thought he might get well. I never thought of poison.
I was examined as a witness on the inquest of the late Mr. Bravo, but from confusion and from a mistaken idea of shielding, as I thought, the character of Mrs. Bravo, I did not tell the full particulars, which I am now anxious to state. There was no cause whatever for his committing suicide for Dr. Gully, and therefore there was not the slightest reason why I should have concealed his name before. Mr. Bravo said, "Mrs. Cox, I have taken poison for Dr. Gully. Don't tell Florence." Beseechingly, those were the words he used when he first told me what he had done.
Mr. Attorney General, upon the evidence presented before the Queen's Bench by the Treasury Solicitor, we have decided to make the rule absolute for directing the coroner to hold a fresh inquiry.
The accommodation presented by the Bedford Hotel at Balham for holding the second inquiry into the cause of Mr. Charles Bravo's death is unusually ample. Not only is the billiards room of much larger dimensions than one might expect in so quiet a locality, but the hotel also affords the advantage of a series of rooms for locating the various classes of witnesses, as well as for the jury and the numerous members of the legal profession who are engaged in this remarkable inquiry. To the general public, who are accustomed to look upon members of the legal profession in the full dress of wig and gown, the personal appearance of most of the gentlemen in the undress observed at an inquest may appear somewhat novel and strange. Sir Henry James, QC, who appears for Mrs. Florence Bravo, might be taken for a descendant of Ignatius Loyola or Machiavelli, while Mr. George Lewis Jr., for the family of Mr. Bravo, displays a certain facial resemblance to that celebrated composer, Mr. Jacques Offenbach. As for Mr. Gorst and Mr. Murphy, their busts might well be taken to repose upon a mantelshelf as representing respectively the arts and science. Mr. Murphy, in fact, appears for Mrs. Cox, while Mr. Gorst, QC, is instructed by the Crown to assist the coroner in his inquiries, a task which Mr. Carter has performed already once in private, but which now he must perform again, in public.
And nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Your name is Joseph Bravo, a merchant of 2 Palace Green, Kensington. The deceased was your son, Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo?
Charles Delaunay Turner was his name. Bravo he took as my stepson.
Mr. Bravo, how long had your son been married?
He was married on the 7th of December, and he died on the 21st of April following. A matter of some 4 or 5 months.
Knowing him as intimately as you did, was he, in your judgment, a likely man to commit suicide?
Not at all. He had not the slightest symptom in any shape or way of tendency to self-destruction.
Was he in any pecuniary difficulty at the time of his death?
Certainly not. I made a settlement of £20,000 upon him at the time of his marriage. He had £1,100 at his stockbroker's, and could have got more from me at once by asking for it.
Did your son at any time, by speech or manner, indicate that he had any feeling of jealousy towards anybody?
Never.
Did he ever mention the name of a doctor at all to you?
Never. I was going to say that is rather a wide question.
Yes, of a certain doctor. I'm not wishful to mention names, but I'm afraid it will be impossible to avoid it. Did he ever mention the name Dr. Gully?
Never.
Now, you've heard from your daughter-in-law since her husband's death. Are these her letters?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. I will read you this of the 6th of May. Dear Father Joseph, a letter this morning from Roy's Bell fully confirms my suspicions as to poor Charlie's suicide. Hence his motive for reducing our expenditure is he could not tell me how hard he had been pressed by that dreadful woman. I wish he had, poor fellow, but it is a most sad reflection on his memory for me, and I intend to sift the matter. I leave it all in my father's hands. Yours sincerely, Florence Bravo. Now, sir.
I'm sorry to ask you this question, and I should not ask it unless it had been suggested by this letter. There's mention in it of a horrid woman. You made an inquiry since your son's death as to the meaning of those words?
I have been informed that he lived with a woman previous to his marriage. I did not know it before.
The expression is not horrid woman.
Dreadful woman.
Thank you.
I rather think it is an expression of one woman towards another, worth nothing.
What was passing through my mind was whether she'd been any annoyance to him since his marriage.
No.
That I was going to ask you.
I understand that the sister of this person entrusted him with £500 to be invested for her. It was not a loan.
5 days at Balham in a very hot and crowded room have yielded little in the way of new information. We have heard the evidence of the doctors who attended him, that Mr. Charles Bravo stated solemnly and repeatedly that he had taken nothing but laudanum to rub on his gums for toothache. It was therefore with keen attention that we began to listen to the evidence today of Professor Redwood, the analytical chemist, as to the nature of the poison from which this young man perished in such dreadful agony.
I found on analysis of the vomited matter no arsenic or mercury, but I found lead and antimony. The presence of the lead a little obscured my first investigations, but I afterwards eliminated that, and then I had no difficulty in finding very abundant evidence of the presence of antimony, of which this is a small portion.
Did it afford any evidence of the quantity?
I took 1/2 of the vomited matter, and I obtained, after treating it in the proper way, 2.5 grains of precipitated sulfide of antimony, which corresponds to 5 grains of emetic tartar. I may say I have some of the vomited matter here, which I have preserved in spirit. It presented very much the appearance of minced meat at the time. The whole of the vomited matter would have yielded 10 grains of emetic tartar.
Would antimony and water be practically tasteless?
Oh, practically, I think it would be tasteless. I have some here. The jury may satisfy themselves. This is a solution consisting of 40 grains in 4 ounces of water. I do not think you will be able to detect any taste in this. You may hold it in the mouth for 2 or 3 minutes.
I do not advise you to swallow it.
As I understand you, there have been 40 grains put into this bottle. Supposing a person had a quantity of tartar emetic and they wished to mix it with water, could they make it soluble by shaking it up?
Certainly.
Can you form any estimate as to the quantity you believe Mr. Bravo must have taken?
In all probability, between 20 and 40 grains.
And with an adult person, you get vomiting with what dose?
From 1 or 2, or sometimes 3 grains.
What time would you expect it to act in that case?
I should expect within half an hour vomiting to be affected. I have not had the opportunity of observing the effect in large doses, but while I was apprenticed to an apothecary in the country, it was not unusual for women to come in and apply for an emetic to put in their husband's drink to sicken them of the habit of drinking.
Or if a husband wished to cure his wife of the habit of drinking. It would not be unusual to keep a quantity of tartar emetic for that purpose.
It would not.
Thank you, Professor.
You are Mary Ann Keeber?
Yes. I have been in Mrs. Bravo's service for 2 years and 3 months as housemaid. For the last 3 months I waited on Mrs. Bravo as well as my other duties as housemaid. I had to see that the rooms were properly settled. I used to leave water in the water bottle in Mr. Bravo's bedroom, which was kept on the washstand, and I had to see that the bottle was full at night. It appeared to me that some of the water was used occasionally during the daytime. I never saw any difference in the character of the water in the bottle.
Now tell us, in your own words, what happened after Mr. Bravo had gone into his room?
I shut Mrs. Bravo's bedroom door and went up the flight of stairs leading to Mrs. Cox's room and called the dog. Mr. Bravo opened his bedroom door in his nightshirt and called Florence twice, and hot water, very loud. I rushed into Mrs. Bravo's bedroom and said, "Mr. Bravo is ill, will you come?" Mrs. Cox got up and went into Mr. Bravo's room. Mr. Bravo was then standing by the window. I stood at the door and saw him. I heard him call again for hot water, and Mrs. Cox said, "Fetch hot water." I went to the kitchen and fetched it in a small water can.
Did you notice his water bottle when you went in his room after he called for his wife?
No.
Can you say positively that it was empty?
No, I cannot say positively that it was empty. I remember filling it up the next morning when I went in to tidy the room.
Now, Miss Kibbert, during the period that Mrs. Bravo was Mrs. Ricardo, before her marriage, was she visited by a Dr. Gully?
Yes.
Was he in the habit of coming to the Priory morning, noon, and night?
I do not know exactly when he came. I didn't open the door to him.
You've seen Mr. and Mrs. Bravo constantly together. Did you ever once hear the name of Dr. Gully from Mr. Bravo's mouth?
No.
Did you ever, during the 4 months Mr. Bravo was in the house, see any indication whatever of any jealousy on his part towards his wife?
Oh, no.
With reference to his conduct towards you, was he a man very kind and considerate towards servants?
He was always very kind to me, and to all of us. He always had a kind word for everybody.
Thank you, Miss Keeber.
The old truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
You are George Griffiths?
I'm a private coachman. I am at present in the service of Lady Prescott of Herne Bay. I was living as coachman with Mrs. Ricardo at the time of her marriage to the late Mr. Bravo. I left her service on the 3rd of January this year. She kept one brown horse and a pair of cobs. I was in the habit of giving those horses tartar emetic. I kept it in the stable.
Where did you buy it?
Some at Balham, sir, and some at Streatham. I could get it at any chemist if I told him what it was for, sir.
How much did you buy?
Quarter of an ounce, sir.
Did your mistress know that you used it?
Oh, I don't know that she did, sir, I'm sure. I used it in lots of cases with horses when they wanted it, sir.
You did not use the quarter ounce at once?
Oh, no, sir. No, that'd do for 40 or 50 times. You know, I dissolved it and made a pint and a half bottle of it.
Where'd you keep it?
I kept it locked up in the stable cupboard, sir, with a label poison on it, sir.
What became of that bottle when you left the Priory?
I broke it, sir. I poured the remainder of what was left down a drain in the yard before I left, sir. I broke the bottle and I threw it on the dung heap, sir.
In whose service were you in before you went to Mrs. Ricardo's?
Dr. Gully's, sir.
How long had you been in Dr. Gully's service at Malvern?
8 years, sir. I left his service when he retired from business and sold all up, like.
When you were in Dr. Gully's service, did you physic his horses with tartar emetic?
Yes, sir. If they wanted it.
And where did you buy your tartar emetic at Malvern?
Oh, any of the chemist shops, sir, but they never let me have more than a quarter of an ounce, sir.
Did you ever buy more than quarter of an ounce?
No, never, sir.
You sure?
No, sir. I have sometimes asked for ounce, but they have refused it, sir.
Did you ever sign for tartar emetic at Mr. Clark?
No, sir, not that I'm aware.
Would you know your own handwriting if you saw it?
I'm not sure that I should, sir.
Is that your handwriting name at the bottom?
Yes, sir.
I'll read you what it is. Sale of poisons register, Mr. Clark's, Malvern. Date, June the 11th, 1869. Name of purchaser, Dr. Gully. Name and quantity of poison sold, 2 ounces tartar emetic. Purpose for which required, horse medicine. Signature of purchaser, George Griffiths.
Did you put that book in?
Yes. Do you recollect buying that tartar emetic?
Yes, sir.
Did Dr. Gully know of your buying that?
I'm not sure that he did, sir. He was against anything of that, sir.
What did you buy such a very large quantity as 2 ounces for? You've told us that quarter of an ounce is enough for 50 embrocations, so 2 ounces would be enough for 400.
Sir, I didn't want to give it all at once, sir. I'd keep it for years and years by me and use a little when I wanted it, sir.
What sort of illness would you give it for?
For worms, sir, and the black box. As things that grows inside horses. Well, there's, sir, you know about that, sir.
Yes, thank you, Griffiths.
Sir.
Who dismissed you from Mr. Bravo's service?
Do not put the question that way. You assume he was dismissed. He may have left himself.
If he was not dismissed, he could say so. Who dismissed you from Mr. Bravo's service?
I was never in Mr. Bravo's service, sir. I left the 3rd of January. Mrs. Ricardo gave me a month's notice before she was married. She told me that Mr. Bravo didn't want me to drive her anymore, so I had to leave. I'd have been there now if he'd not been there.
During the time you were in Dr. Gully's service, where did you buy tartar emetic?
At Clark's in Church Street, sir.
Do you mean to say you did not buy tartar emetic for Dr. Gully?
Well, sir, I'm not sure whether I did or not, sir.
Upon your oath, did not Dr. Gully send you for that tartar emetic?
He did not, sir.
Will you positively swear he did not?
Yes, sir. Well, if he did, I've forgotten it. I mean, I can't say no fairer.
Oh, may Dr. Gully have sent you for it and you've forgotten it?
Oh, no, sir, he never did.
I ask you upon your solemn oath whether you were not sent to that shop by Dr. Gully.
I was not, sir. I swear that positively.
You've just now said you might have forgotten it. What do you say now?
Well, I'm not sure, sir, whether he sent me or not, sir.
You know the responsibility under which you are giving evidence. Do you wish those gentlemen to believe you?
Well, they can do what they like about that, sir, can't they? Look, sir, I don't study things 5 or 6 years back, sir. I mean, I can't get my living at work, not in thinking about things of that kind. I don't remember Captain Ricardo being taken ill, but I remember hearing of it.
You remember his being taken ill at Malvern?
No, he was nearly always ill, sir. Every day there was something the matter with him. I don't remember the captain being ill in 1869. I don't remember Dr. Gully's horses being ill in 1869.
At the time you bought that antimony, were any of his horses ill?
No, sir, they never were ill. We gave them the antimony to keep them from being ill.
My position is intolerable. What am I to do? There were 3 more letters by this morning's post. I shall be obliged to burn everything before I open it. I shall give evidence in court myself. I must be heard.
Well, that's your right, of course. As your counsel, I will advise if I think it best.
Well, surely my reputation will count for something. Against Griffiths?
I understand your mind is quite a blank as to dates when you saw Mr. or Mrs. Ricardo at Malvern.
Yes, sir.
But you married the lady's maid in Mrs. Bravo's employ.
She lived with me at the lodge, sir, whilst I was at the Priory. But after my marriage, Mrs. Bravo's maid was some other person than my wife, sir.
I see. Now tell us again exactly where you kept the tartar emetic.
At the Priory, sir, I kept the tartar emetic in a cupboard at the stables. The cupboard was locked and I had the key.
You say that it was locked?
Well, I don't know that it was always locked, sir. The stable room was always locked. Mrs. Bravo never interfered with the cupboard or its contents, sir. Well, I never saw her look into the cupboard, sir, but she might have done. She came in sometimes in the morning to have a look at her cob, sir. See, I said this morning that the cupboard in which the poisons were kept was not always locked, sir.
Did not you tell me yesterday that it was always locked?
Well, I don't recollect whether I did or not, sir. It was always locked at night, and the stable rooms was locked up, too. I don't know whether that cupboard was ever locked, sir. I had the key, and the cupboard was generally left open. But the bottle was labelled poison, sir. I mean, anybody could go in and help themselves if they chose to drink poison, sir, but the word poison was on the bottle, sir.
Thank you, Griffiths.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Griffiths, do you remember hearing that Mr. Bravo was about to be married?
Yes, sir.
And now just be careful. Did you express an opinion that he would not live long?
Oh, sir, not I recollect.
Will you swear you did not?
Oh, sir, I don't think that I did, sir.
You
I
never
cannot swear that.
Never did?
No, sir. Not that I recollect.
Just reflect and tell me whether you remember having said to anybody at the period of his marriage, poor fellow, he will not live long.
Oh, no, sir. No, not that I recollect. Well, I might have done, sir. I said all I could about him when I knew he got me out the house.
That is an expression you would not have forgotten.
Well, I might have said so, sir.
To whom?
Well, to anybody who asked me anything about him. I mean, very likely I said it in public, like, sir, if I did say it.
And what did you mean by it?
Oh, I meant nothing at all, sir.
Did you express an opinion that he would not live 4 months?
No, sir.
Will you swear so?
Yes, I will, sir.
Let Mr. Stringer come up, please.
Who's Mr. Stringer, sir? The landlord of this hotel.
You know Mr. Stringer here?
Sir.
Did you not use the words to him, poor fellow?
Sir, I don't recollect using the words poor fellow, sir.
Oh, alluding to Mr. Bravo, did you say he would not live 4 months?
I don't recollect saying that, sir, though I
There
cannot
he
swear
is,
that.
face to face. Will you swear you did not say to that man standing there, poor fellow, he will not live 4 months?
I did not say 4 months, sir.
Who did you say many months?
Well, I might have said 5 months, sir, or 6 months, or something like that, sir.
What did you mean by it?
I just said it for aggravation, sir, nothing else. And then it was his fault for getting me from her service, sir.
But why should he die?
I don't know, sir, I'm sure. It didn't matter to me whether he was alive or dead. Not then.
How long did you give him to live?
I don't know, sir.
How long?
I'm sorry, sir.
Did he appear to be suffering from anything when you saw him, or was he in perfectly good health?
I do not think he was in very good health, sir.
As you read the papers, I suppose you were not surprised to see that he had died within 4 months, according to your prophecy.
Yes, sir, I was surprised to see the death of him in the paper, sir.
By tartar emetic?
Yes, sir.
Did that surprise you?
No, sir.
I am the wife of Mr. Robert Campbell, who resides at Buscott Park in Berkshire. Mr. Campbell has been High Sheriff of his county.
Your eldest daughter is now Mrs. Florence Bravo.
Yes, I also have a son and 2 daughters.
I believe your daughter stayed with you at Buscott Park after her husband's death.
Yes, when I went down to her...
Mrs. Campbell went through the details of her daughter's history, answering Sir Henry James with an impressive directness and authority. During the afternoon, the room became oppressively hot, and the court decided to adjourn and continue the examination of Mrs. Campbell the following day.
You said yesterday, no doubt with justification, that Mrs. Bravo's first husband, Captain Ricardo, drank a great deal. When did he begin to drink?
He drank more or less after his marriage, but became very much worse in 2 or 3 years.
Did you frequently hear of Captain Ricardo suffering from vomiting?
Yes, he told me he had been sick 60 times in a day.
You expressed your astonishment.
I did. He admitted it was from the wine and spirits he had taken and promised faithfully he'd give it up.
Did you ever speak to Mr. Charles Bravo about his having mentioned Dr. Gully to his wife?
I never saw him from January until he was ill. I was in Italy.
Well, it is only since his death you heard of it. Did Mrs. Cox or Mrs. Bravo give that as a reason why he should have committed suicide?
No, certainly not. But I discussed the theory of suicide with all of our family.
Did you discuss the probability?
No, I did not. For I never supposed any such thing.
Did Mrs. Cox or Mrs. Bravo suggest murder?
Never.
Only suicide.
Yes.
There's been a good deal of conversation as to where Mr. Charles Bravo could have procured this tartar emetic. Did either Mrs. Cox or your daughter suggest in what way he might have procured it?
My daughter suggested he might have got it from his father's stables, but she gave no reason. She said he might have helped himself to it from the stables cupboard. I understand that Mr. Joseph Bravo's coachman kept antimony for his horses.
Did she tell you that Mr. Joseph Bravo's coachman kept antimony?
She did not know anything about it then. Mr. Joseph Bravo told my husband later that his coachman kept antimony, and my husband told me of it afterwards. I think my daughter heard it also.
Have you ever kept antimony in your stables?
Never to my knowledge.
Did you ever tell Mr. Campbell or anybody else that you had?
It is not an accurate statement.
Did you make that statement to Mr. Campbell?
I never did make that statement.
Have you ever known of antimony being applied to your horses?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Bravo.
Had you any conversation at all with Mr. Campbell upon the subject of antimony?
Certainly not.
Is your recollection that the subject of antimony was never mentioned?
My recollection is perfect, Sir Henry. I may mention that on Thursday, the 27th of April, after the post-mortem examination, Mr. Campbell called on me at Palace Green. The subject of discussion was my son's death. The cause of his death, we knew then, was antimony. I told Mr. Campbell then that antimony was...
Thank you, Mr. Bravo.
That antimony was a poison used by persons desiring to take the lives of others. That no man I ever heard of used it to take his own life.
You are Mr. John Jepson Atkinson?
Yes. I'm a barrister. I have chambers in the Temple. I first knew Mr. Bravo at Oxford. From that time until his death, I was on very intimate terms with him. We lived in rooms together at the university for upwards of 2 years.
Did you have chambers together at number 1 Essex Court?
From 1870.
Are you aware of any particular habit he had before going to bed?
I noticed that he always drank a very large drink of cold water. In fact, I've never seen him go to bed without doing so.
Did you observe where he took it from?
He usually took it from the water bottle in his or my room, and almost invariably without using a tumbler.
You would describe this as an inveterate habit?
An invariable habit.
It's hardly necessary to ask you the question, but as your knowledge of him was so intimate, was he, in your judgment, a man likely to commit suicide?
He was the last man in the world. And I should like to say why I think so.
Please.
He was better acquainted than any barrister I know with medicine and medical jurisprudence. He was a very clear-headed man, with a very great deal of common sense, and very little sentiment. No feeling for any woman would make him take a painful and uncertain poison, the effects of which he was thoroughly acquainted with. I also know that he was in no money difficulty.
Thank you, sir.
Now look, that's Mrs. Cox. Look,
That's right. She knows a thing or two. She knows what it's all about.
I believe you are a widow residing in Manchester Square.
Yes.
In the later part of the summer of 1875, did you and Mrs. Ricardo go to Brighton?
Yes, we did.
In Brighton, did she meet Mr. Charles Bravo accidentally?
Yes.
And that led to his visiting at your lodgings?
Yes.
Subsequently, did you ascertain from Mrs. Ricardo that he had made a proposal of marriage to her?
Yes.
Did anything occur between you at that time with reference to her friendship with Dr. Gully?
Mrs. Ricardo wrote to Dr. Gully saying that their acquaintance must cease. I advised her to tell Mr. Charles Bravo all about it.
I really must request that the witness either stands up or speaks louder at this moment, because now we're coming to a matter that is of considerable importance.
I really think the witness is doing all she can.
I think she might speak a little louder.
Yes, I'm really very anxious to hear this lady's voice. Surely if she can speak over a dinner table, she can speak loud enough for me to hear when I sit opposite her.
Listen, once! This is terrible in the court of justice. I'm not surprised that this is not behind something to a demonstration of this kind.
There's a kind of reign of terror behind the man.
Mr. Officer, you'll understand. If you have a repetition of this kind of thing, I shall have the room cleared.
Yes, sir.
Will you try and raise your voice and state to us what advice you gave to Mrs. Ricardo?
I advised her to tell Mr. Bravo all about her acquaintance with Dr. Gully.
We can hear that very well.
And did she inform you afterwards as to whether she had taken that advice?
Yes, she did.
In March and April, you had some chance meetings with Dr. Gully. What happened on Balham Station?
It was after Mrs. Bravo's miscarriage. I told him of the intense pains she was suffering and of her want of sleep. He said he would let me know what was best for her. I told him I was going to my house in the Lancaster Road.
And did you find any communication from Dr. Gully there?
Not on that day. I returned on the Monday and found the treatment. That she was to have sitz baths. There was also a small bottle of laurel water.
And did you tell Mrs. Bravo what had occurred between you and Dr. Gully?
Yes, I told her of it. She said she did not require the medicine as she had slept without and would rather not take it. She asked me to put it away in my room.
Was there any time on the day after his illness when you and Mr. Bravo were alone together?
Yes. Mr. Royce Bell asked me to stay with him for a while. As soon as Mr. Bell went out of the room, Mr. Bravo turned to me and said, "Why did you tell them? Does Florence know I have poisoned myself?" I said, "What have you taken, Charlie?" He turned his head away and said impatiently, "I don't know." After that, his wife came into the room.
You told us, he said, "Why did you tell them?" Did you make any answer to that?
Yes. I said I was obliged to tell them. I could not let you die.
Did you mention this conversation to the surgeons or anybody?
No, I did not.
Why was that?
Because I thought he did not wish them to know.
On the 18th, do you recollect if the decanter of water had been used at the time you went into his room?
No, I never noticed it.
Have you the slightest knowledge of any person having gone to the water bottle that evening, or changed it, or emptied it, or interfered with it?
No. But I should not know anything at all about that. It is the housemaid who would know about the water being changed.
Thank you.
Mrs. Cox, when was the engagement between Mr. Bravo and Mrs. Ricardo made?
I believe on November the 1st.
I suppose you'd had conversations with Mr. Bravo before the engagement?
Yes, I had.
From these conversations, were you under the impression that Mr. Bravo knew that Mrs. Ricardo had had an intimate relationship with Dr. Gully?
I know that Mrs. Ricardo told Mr. Bravo everything about Dr. Gully.
Will you answer my question? Were you under the impression that Mr. Bravo knew that Mrs. Ricardo had an intimate relationship with Dr. Gully?
I can tell you that Mr. Bravo knew everything that had taken place with Dr. Gully.
Answer my question, madam!
From these conversations, were you under the impression that Mr. Bravo knew that Mrs. Ricardo had had an intimate connection with Dr. Gully?
Knew of it on November the 1st?
That is the time I'm speaking of.
No, not then.
So it was your impression that he then believed Mrs. Ricardo to be a perfectly chaste woman?
I believe that before the marriage, he knew everything, but not then. I kept nothing back before the marriage. At least I did. But let me fully understand what you mean.
You say you kept something back before the marriage? What was it?
I kept back from him what Mrs. Bravo told me after she had given up her acquaintance with Dr. Gully.
And what was it she told you?
Of her intimacy with Dr. Gully.
And what do you mean by that?
I suppose you can draw your own conclusions.
Oh, no, I decline to do that. Tell me, madam, was it a physical intimacy with Dr. Gully she had told you of?
I do not remember what her words were that she used.
Then what do you believe it was she had told you?
She told me of her intimacy with Dr. Gully.
Physical intimacy?
Yes. But you remember, I had no idea of that during her acquaintance with Dr. Gully. I had no idea of any wrong intimacy with Dr. Gully during her acquaintance with Dr. Gully. Not the slightest.
Then when was it she told you?
Before leaving Brighton. And I urged her to tell Mr. Charles Bravo. Which she did.
He ever tell you that she had confessed that intimacy had been physical?
Yes, he did. At Palace Green.
Now, was there anything that occurred at dinner on the 18th that would account for Mr. Bravo committing suicide that night?
No. Not that I know of.
Had Mrs. Bravo taken that night what you may call more wine than was good for her health?
Well, she had had the glass of Marsala and the other that Marianne took up.
Answer my question.
I did not see, I do not know. It was perhaps more than she ought to have taken.
Now, how long should you think elapsed between Mr. Bravo leaving his wife's dressing room and Mary Ann coming to you with the news of his illness?
I should fancy between 10 minutes and a quarter of an hour. When I went to him, his bedroom door was open and he was standing by the window. It was whilst at the window that he said he had taken poison.
Now, was not Mary Ann standing on the other side of the open door?
I never noticed her.
Well, supposing she were standing by the door of Mr. Bravo's bedroom, could she not see him at the window?
If she was standing at the door of the room, of course she could.
I ask you whether Mary Ann Keeper was not in a position, watching that man by the window, to have heard what took place.
I do not know how soon after she came to the door.
Is that your answer, madam?
She has already said she did not see Keeper.
I must beg of you not to interpose at such an important part of the evidence.
I will not interpose at an improper moment.
I must appeal to you, sir, to ask Mr. Murphy not to interpose at a period of very great moment.
The coroner shall decide whether I have interposed improperly. The witness has already said she did not see whether Keeper was there or not. And Mr. Lewis assumes she was there, and the witness has never said anything of the kind.
This is done in the hearing of the jury.
Everything is done in the hearing of the jury.
I told you, I do not know whether she was there.
My question is whether, standing at the open door, Keeper could hear what passed at the window.
I do not know whether she could have heard or not, because, as I tell you, Mr. Charles Bravo did not speak in a loud tone when he told me that.
Do you know that he denied all through having taken poison?
I understood that he acknowledged having taken poison to Sir William Gull. That what he had taken himself.
At the first inquest, did you swear falsely?
I do not consider it swearing falsely. I withheld some words.
Oh, what were those words?
For Dr. Gully. Mr. Bravo said, I have taken poison. For Dr. Gully, don't tell Florence.
And you do not consider you swore falsely?
I did not consider so.
You would think it very wicked to have done so?
I never thought of myself. I thought of Mrs. Bravo.
How was that not a false statement you had made in the interests of Mrs. Bravo?
Except withholding the name of Dr. Gully. I told the truth.
Was that in the interests of Mrs. Bravo?
I withheld those words for Mrs. Bravo's sake, for her reputation's sake. She had no idea of it.
I wish to make very little inquiry into it, but I should like to know this. You have the most eminent counsel representing you here. Is that at the expense of Mrs. Florence Bravo's family?
I do not think that is any concern of the present inquiry.
You do not wish to answer?
That is quite sufficient.
You may answer that, if Mr. Lewis wishes it.
It is not at my own expense.
Thank you, Mrs. Cox.
Whether rightly or wrongly, did your feeling of gratitude towards Mrs. Bravo cause you to wish that the circumstances of her connection with Dr. Gully should not be known more than was necessary?
Yes. That was the entire reason.
I suppose as soon as you lived with her, you observed this sad habit of hers of drinking more than was good for her health.
Yes, soon after. I understood from her that she acquired the habit during her life with her first husband. He often left her, used violence towards her.
And this led to her drinking. Well, it was very natural, wasn't it, that in this unhappy state she should turn for companionship to Dr. Gully.
Oh, yes. Dr. Gully was a very fascinating man.
Yes. Now, I wish there to be no concealment about this. The family of Mrs. Bravo thought that this lady should have someone to protect her interests on this inquiry. Mr. Lewis got that out, and I make the statement. Now, Mrs. Cox, you stated that Mrs. Bravo was fond of her horses and was in the habit of going into the stable sometimes.
Yes.
Did Mr. Bravo also go into the stables to look at the horses and take an interest in what was going on in the stable?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Now, had Mrs. Bravo ever, to your knowledge, any antimony in her possession? Or did you ever see any in the house at the Priory?
No.
Never.
Never.
Thank you, Mrs. Cox.
Mrs. Cox, upon the solemn oath that you've taken to tell us the whole truth of this matter, was there ever one word passed between you and Dr. Gully about poison or antimony or anything of that kind during the meetings you had with Dr. Gully?
No, never.
Thank you, Mrs. Cox.
There she is now. If you please. If you please, madam.
If I were as cowardly as you are, I would not be here today. Can I?
Were you her lover?
Yes.
Then half of England will hold you guilty of as great a crime as murder. Lewis will make sure of that.
Love? As vile as murder?
Oh, my dear fellow, some of them think it worse.
Mrs. Bravo was escorted by her brother, Mr. William Campbell. Surely the ordeal which this poor lady must endure today should win for her the sympathy of every fair-minded Englishman. The room became densely crowded, among those present being Lord Alfred Paget, Sir Charles Russell, Sir William Fraser, and Mr. Henry Irving, listening with rapt attention to every word spoken by the poor lady in her low, sweet voice in answer to Sir Henry James.
Now, Mrs. Bravo, I believe you have to state there was at one time an improper intimacy between yourself and Dr. Gully.
There was. I will answer.
I have to ask you. When was the first occasion the intimacy took place?
At Kissing.
And was that during your visit in the autumn of 1873?
Yes, it was.
In November of that year, did you suffer from an illness?
Yes,
And were you, upon that occasion, attended by Dr. Gully?
I was.
I believe the cause of the illness was a miscarriage.
It was.
And did you do your utmost to conceal the knowledge of the fact from everyone about you?
I did.
As far as you know, was Mrs. Cox aware of what your illness was?
No,
You did all you could to prevent her knowing.
I did.
I believe you suffered acutely on that occasion.
I owed my life to Mrs. Cox. She was everything that could be.
Now, I must ask you to state, in your own way, how long that improper intimacy with Dr. Gully continued.
It ceased on our return from abroad.
Well, you have had to make this acknowledgement of your error. Do you now state positively that that visit terminated your improper intimacy with Dr. Gully?
Yes, it did.
We know of your statement to the Treasury Solicitor, Mrs. Bravo, in which you said that that intimacy was an innocent one.
When I informed Mr. Charles Bravo of that,
intimacy. He made me take my solemn oath before God not to divulge it. I was not on oath at the Treasury.
What was it you told Mr. Bravo in relation to your conduct?
That I had erred in 1873, and that I had had a miscarriage in November of the same year.
And that you state on your oath, you told him?
That I state on my oath, I told him.
I believe, Mrs. Bravo, since you gave your evidence yesterday, you have made some communications to your friends which you have not made before.
Yes.
And your attention has been called to your statement that your first intimacy with Dr. Gully occurred at Kissingen in August 1873.
Yes.
I believe, all through the years of your acquaintance with Dr. Gully, you were most anxious not to be regarded as the mistress of Dr. Gully.
Yes.
Again, begging you to tell us the whole truth, I believe you wish now to correct your evidence. And will you tell me, was there any intimacy whatever between you and Dr. Gully on any occasion before the visit to Kissingen?
Yes.
Have you any correction to make in your evidence as to the nature of your intimacy with Dr. Gully after the visit to Kissingen in 1873?
No, I have not.
Give the girl a chance.
After your visit to Kissingen, after your miscarriage, in fact, you now repeat on your oath there was no such intimacy?
No, there was not.
So far as you can judge, had Mrs. Cox any knowledge of the intimacy before the Kissingen visit?
No, she had not.
I have only one more question to ask you upon this portion of the case, and that is, did any such intimacy occur during the lifetime of your first husband?
No.
There were 2 or 3 occasions, Mrs. Bravo, when there was some harshness of language used by your second husband towards you. Or there were some differences between you on some 2 or 3 occasions.
I do not want to say anything against him.
Oh, I will take it very generally. Now, there was one occasion, I believe, when he struck you.
Yes, but he burst into tears immediately he had done it. He was only like a child, a child's passion. He was excessively sorry for it afterwards.
With these slight exceptions, to which I will not for your sake further refer, was your husband's conduct one of kindness towards you?
Yes, very kind.
You were, I believe, to some extent annoyed as to his views on money matters.
That was all through his mother. We never had a word between ourselves as long as we were left to ourselves.
Well, take by way of example the last 6 weeks of his married life with you. Were you upon terms of sincere affection?
We were as happy as the day is long, because his mother was away at St. Leonard.
He was kind and attentive to you.
Yes, very.
Now, Mrs. Bravo, I have to ask you, have you any recollection ever at any time of having obtained or purchased any antimony anywhere?
Never. I never heard the word antimony until I learned that my husband's death had been caused by it.
Or tartaremetic. The word antimony is not so material. Do you know of its use, or have you obtained it anywhere?
I have since learned that it is taken as an emetic. I never used it myself, and I never obtained it.
Except that which you have told us today, have you the slightest knowledge how your husband came by his death?
No.
That is all I have to ask, Mrs. Bravo.
Mrs. Bravo, was your husband in the habit of drinking water before he went to bed?
No, he was not.
Did he generally drink anything after his dinner?
Coffee, generally. Nothing else.
Had he drunk any coffee on the night of the seizure?
No.
You've told my learned friend Sir Henry James that your husband was in the habit, morning, noon, and night, of mentioning the name of Dr. Gully.
Yes, he was.
Was that during the whole period of your marriage?
The whole.
Well, during the early part of April, your husband was absent from you at sessions, and we have from him letters written to you on the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th of April, in which he uses such phrases as, "My heart is far from gay. I do not believe any love can be greater than mine. Your absence is the winter of my discontent, and the prospect of meeting you again, glorious summer. If you are as glad to see me as I shall be to see you, 2 of the happiest people in the world will meet tomorrow." Now, do you mean to say after these letters you represent to the jury that this gentleman was always morning, noon and night speaking of Dr. Gully in disparaging terms?
I do.
Did you ever tell anyone so during his lifetime?
I told Mrs. Cox.
Oh, other than Mrs. Cox.
I told my mother.
In his lifetime?
At Buscott. In his lifetime.
Now, Mrs. Bravo, during the portion of the year 1870, between May and November, you and your first husband were at Malvern together, on and off.
Yes.
Was there anything that occurred at Malvern that you wished kept secret at that time? No sort of familiarity between Dr. Gully and yourself you wished kept secret?
No.
Nothing you wished your servants to conceal, or that you would feel ashamed for them to disclose to anyone at all?
No.
Had you a maid by the name of Landon?
Yes, I have.
Is this letter in your handwriting, madam?
Yes, it is.
I will read it to you. It is dated the 16th of November, Buscott Park.
May we know the year?
You will see from the contents that it must be 1870. Dear Landon, nobody regrets more than I do that circumstances compel my parting with you, for I like you personally. I will do all I can to procure you a good situation. I hope you will never allude in any way to anyone of what passed at Malvern. Let it be buried in the past, and if anyone questions you, please refuse to answer any inquiries. With kind remembrances, Florence Ricardo, burn this. Now, Mrs. Bravo, what was it that was never to be alluded to by anyone, but to be buried in the past, and no inquiries answered?
That I had an attachment, but not a physical one, to Dr. Gully. I do not see how it relates to my husband's death. Mr. Lewis, I have been sufficiently pained and humiliated. I appeal to the coroner and the members of the jury as gentlemen and Britons to protect me. I think it is a great shame. I am willing to tell you anything to find out how Mr. Charles Bravo met his death. But with Dr. Gully, you have nothing to do, and I refuse to answer you any further questions.
You represent that you told Mr. Charles Bravo of this connection?
You have heard it.
Will you look at this passage of this letter, madam?
She knew of my attachment to Dr. Gully. It seems to be impossible that a woman can love a man without doing what is wrong with him, according to you.
You use the terms not to allude to anything of what passed at Malvern. What passed?
I have told you.
And that, Mrs. Bravo, is your explanation of this letter.
Mrs. Bravo, was there a deed of separation between you and Captain Ricardo before his death?
Yes, at my instigation.
Who were the trustees on your behalf?
My father, I think, but I am not sure.
Was not Dr. Gully one?
No, most decidedly not. Dr. Gully had nothing to do with it. He did not even know of it, to my knowledge.
Are you quite sure that Dr. Gully was not one and Mr. Brooks the other? Here is the deed.
I am quite certain, so far as I can recollect.
Officer.
And who produces the deed?
I'll prove it.
Does it come from the Crown?
I will prove it. Is that your signature to the deed?
Yes, that is my signature.
The Crown produces this?
It's dated the 1st of March, 1871. Trustees on behalf of Mrs. Ricardo are Dr. Gully and Mr. Brooks.
I had no recollection of it, Mr. Gorst.
Now, Mrs. Bravo, you made up your mind, you've told us, to break off the long-standing relation with Dr. Gully before you made the acquaintance of Mr. Charles Bravo, long before you entertained the idea of making Mr. Charles Bravo your husband.
Yes.
And I understand you to say, carefully and solemnly, your only motive for that was a desire for reconciliation with your family.
My only motive was to see my mother again and make her happy, because I had heard that she was in very delicate health, and I was prepared to sacrifice all my happiness to hers.
Then why did you wait so long before that attempted reconciliation with your family?
I really do not know. I had written to Dr. Gully while he was abroad. I had written to him in affectionate and friendly terms.
Without giving him any intimation that you were going to break off the intimacy?
No. I did not wish to spoil his holiday.
I see.
Mrs. Bravo, I must trouble you with a few questions. During the whole period of your intimacy with Dr. Gully, did he always behave with great kindness and consideration towards you?
he did.
Has Dr. Gully honorably fulfilled his agreement with you not to have any kind of communication with you after your marriage?
Yes. He has never seen me, to my knowledge.
I mean directly or indirectly, secretly or openly.
No.
Had Dr. Gully, after your marriage, any means of private access to the Priory?
No. Certainly not.
Thank you, Mrs. Bravo.
During the illness of Mr. Bravo, did Mrs. Cox render all the assistance that was possible?
Yes, she did.
And do you extend the same kindly feeling toward Mrs. Cox at present that you have done during all the years of your acquaintance with her?
I think she might have spared me a great many of these painful inquiries that have been made.
Make way, please. Bravo!
You are James Manby Gully?
Yes.
Will you be sworn?
Yes. I swear by Almighty God the evidence I give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Dr. Gully, will you be seated?
No, why should he sit? What for?
May I ask what is the meaning of this?
I think it is only that the jury want to see the witness.
The privilege of being seated is only given as a rule to ladies.
The jury prefer the witness to stand.
If it is the wish of the jury, the witness will stand.
The witnesses usually stand in other courts, particularly the male witnesses.
It's only that I'm a little weak today.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm not the least desire the witness should stand.
I'm sure if Dr. Gully wishes to be seated, there will be no objection.
I have no objection, not the slightest. I will stand.
Dr. Gully, how long have you practiced the profession of medicine?
44 years. I'm a doctor of medicine of the University of Edinburgh.
Did you practice hydropathy at Malvern for about 30 years?
9 and 20 years I practiced at Malvern.
Do you come here to be examined voluntarily at your own wish?
Entirely.
We have heard from Mrs. Bravo of your unfortunate intimacy with that lady.
Too true, sir, too true.
Have you read what that lady has stated in reference to that intimacy?
I have.
And is that statement true and correct?
I'm sorry to say it is. I feel my position most bitterly.
You will no doubt have heard of the rumors and suspicions that have been created by this inquiry.
I have.
Now, Dr. Gully, on your solemn oath, had you anything to do, either directly or indirectly, with causing the death of young Mr. Charles Bravo?
On my solemn oath, I never had anything to do with it directly or indirectly.
The jury asked me to say they would like the witness to sit.
Thank you.
I would like to say, gentlemen, that my only reason for asking Dr. Gully if he would like to be seated is that I did know he had been suffering from a severe illness. That is my only motive. And now, besides these rumors and suspicions which I have alluded to, have you also received a number of threatening and insulting letters?
I have a great number. Far too many to be pleasant.
Now, Dr. Gully, I will ask you this. Have you ever had in your possession any tartar emetic or antimony in any quantity?
I can state on oath that since the year 1842, when I went to Malvern, I have never possessed, ordered, or prescribed a single grain of that drug allopathically.
Have you ever prescribed tartar emetic homeopathically?
Rarely. I have at times.
I suppose when it is used in infinitesimal doses.
Oh, yes.
Have you ever had any dealings with a Mr. Clark, a chemist at Malvern?
Not to my recollection at all.
We have it in evidence here that in June the 11th, 1869, Griffiths, who was then the coachman to yourself, purchased 2 ounces of antimony from Mr. Clark. Now, did you know of that purchase at the time?
Not in the least.
If you had known of it, would you have allowed your horses to be treated with antimony?
Indeed, I should not. I treated my horses myself. I do not know of the purchase of that 2 ounces of antimony. In fact, I had ordered Griffiths not, no, indeed, to give my horses drugs. I treated them myself, hydropathically.
I wish to avoid prolixity as much as possible. But it is stated here that in March and April you had 5 chance meetings with Mrs. Cox. Now, I don't want to go into the details of those meetings, except in one, when Mrs. Cox met you in Balham Station. It is when Mrs. Cox told you that Mrs. Bravo had been taken ill. She could not sleep. Now, do you remember that circumstance?
Perfectly. Mrs. Cox asked me if I could suggest anything. Later that day, I stopped at Smith's, as my old allopathic knowledge was rather rusty, and I asked him to show me the pharmacopoeia. From that, I learned the dose. I purchased half an ounce of the medicine laurel cerasee, made up as laurel water. And I left it at her house in the Lancaster Road.
Dr. Gully, I must call your attention to the suggestion that is made. Did you put tartar emetic into that bottle of laurel water?
No, sir. I had no tartar emetic to do so with.
So is that suggestion a wicked and infamous falsehood?
It is most infamous.
Thank you, Dr. Gully.
Had you given orders at any time, Dr. Gully, not to admit Mrs. Cox to your house?
I had immediately after my separation from Mrs. Ricardo.
Did you or did you not wish it unknown that you were introducing laurel water to the Priory?
No, I did not wish to communicate with the Priory in any way whatever. But Mrs. Cox, having asked for my advice, I gave a suggestion, that is all.
Did you wish it concealed from Mr. Bravo?
Not if Mrs. Cox thought it proper to tell him.
Then it was immaterial to you whether Mr. Bravo knew or not?
No, Mr. Lewis. I did not want to offend Mr. Bravo. He might have been offended, and I did not want to offend him. I was willing to aid anyone I could. I will prescribe for you if you wish. He told me a lady was suffering in a certain way.
And you prescribed for her?
Yes. My impression was I was doing no harm, because I did not wish to do harm.
Did you tell Mrs. Bravo that you would die if she separated herself from you?
Oh, no.
Nothing of the kind?
No, nothing of the kind, not even in a poetical flight. I told her I should be very unhappy for a while.
Let me ask you, Dr. Gully, how old are you?
I'm in my 68th year.
You were the medical attendant of Captain Ricardo at one time for a short period?
No.
Did you ever attend him?
Never.
Did your partner?
No.
I don't wish to pursue this matter further, but during the period that Captain Ricardo's wife was a patient of yours at Malvern, did this attachment between you and her commence?
It commenced after a fashion. It was a mere friendly understanding between us at that time. She was alone a great deal, and I used to take tea with her and invite her to tea with other ladies to my house and so forth.
That is no answer to my question. Did this attachment commence during the period this lady was a patient of yours in 1870?
Oh, if you please to call it so, yes.
Oh, it is not what I please to call it, sir, but what you please to call it. Now, do you know what passed between Mrs. Ricardo and yourself in November 1870 that would induce her to write to her maid begging her not to allude to it, but to let it be buried in the past?
I cannot conceive.
And you refuse to answer inquiries?
I cannot conceive what it was. There was nothing that passed between us that need not be known.
When did you know she had forsaken her family for you?
In the spring of 71, I think, when I returned from abroad.
You knew she'd surrendered her name, her family, her home, and everybody?
No, I knew nothing of the sort.
You knew she'd surrendered her good name?
No, I do not think she had.
Her honor, sir, that is what I mean.
No.
Do you mean to say there had been no physical intimacy between you?
I mean to say on my oath there had not been.
What time is this you're speaking of?
The spring of 1871.
Oh, between 1871 and 1875, I am speaking of.
You were speaking of 71 just now.
Mr. Coroner, the inquiry before us is into the cause of the death of Mr. Charles Bravo. Mr. Lewis is now asking questions which in no doubt have the effect of inflicting a kind of moral torture upon this witness. What I submit to you is that what happened in 1871 is not relevant to this inquiry.
I put it to Mr. Lewis whether it is necessary to carry on with this line of examination.
To Mr. Sergeant Parry, I will only reply this. He's generally patient and discreet. If he'd waited until the next question had been put, he would have seen the relevancy of the question.
Then you'd better go on.
Thank you. You were aware that she had sacrificed her honor and her family for you during these years 1872 to 1873?
If you put it that way, yes.
Did there come a time when she asked you to sacrifice your little house at Balham?
There did not come a time when she asked me to sacrifice my house at Balham.
Do you mean to say you did not refuse with indignation?
I did not refuse at all.
Did it ever occur to you, Dr. Gully, to leave the neighborhood?
No.
Thank you, sir.
I suppose you knew nothing of anything past between Mr. Bravo and his wife?
Nothing whatever. They might have been 500 miles away from me. For what I knew of her affairs or their mode of life.
I suppose you knew nothing of any sorrow he had, or any wound that could only be healed by time, or anything on his mind?
Nothing of the kind.
And did you know that he wished never to see the Priory again?
No.
That is all I have to ask, Dr. Gully.
We have no questions to put to this witness.
Dr. Gully, I understand you had never seen Mr. Charles Bravo.
Never.
Do you recollect on the occasion of the October visit to Brighton, when you were driving in the carriage of Mrs. Ricardo, a gentleman raising his hat? Because we have it in evidence from Mrs. Bravo that Mr. Bravo passed at the time and raised his hat. I want to reconcile your statement with hers.
I do not recall the incident. I had a curiosity to see him, certainly, but it was never gratified.
Thank you.
Yes, I should like to have known whom my friend had married.
Mr. Foreman, gentlemen, have you agreed on your verdict?
We have.
Have you placed it in writing?
I have.
Are you unanimous? Have 12 agreed?
We have.
The verdict of the jury is, we find that Mr. Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo did not commit suicide, that he did not meet his death by misadventure, but that he was willfully murdered by the administration of tartar emetic. But there is not sufficient evidence to fix the guilt on any person or persons.
It's the worst possible verdict, I'm afraid.
It was not your verdict. We are in a twilight now until we die, neither in guilt or innocence.
Something may be proved. I'm told that Scotland Yard still believes it was suicide.
There was no glass or bottle with any trace of antimony.
He could have taken it from a paper and destroyed it. There was a good fire in the room.
No. Did I ever tell you that I treated Mr. Tennyson at Malvern when he was still a young man? Some lines of his I recall to them. A lie which is all a lie may be met and fought with outright. But a lie which is part of truth is a harder matter to fight. Of course, she was always a dreadful fibber. That was partly why I loved her. And perhaps why she loved me. She had a way of turning things to please her fancy, as children do in play. A rag doll becomes a prince. But she had to choose the game. That it should come to this.
was put on here. No, there's one. There's one. No. This is one for me. Edward never found it. Silly creature. She's gone. You go. So I told her. I don't need you. I don't need anyone to tell me. You, oh, silly creature. I manage well enough. I always manage. I manage everything. Just a little trouble. It's just the wind. The wind is terrible. It's just for pain. Charlie, not again.
If it is your house, you are my wife, and you belong to me.
Belong? I don't belong to anyone.
No, Charlie, I forgive you, Charlie.
I say she shall not sleep in your room, or you will see what I shall do.
I shall not be bullied by you. Your silly threats mean nothing to me. You're nothing but a foolish child.
No, not again.
Florence.
I let Marianne know. I put it in his water bottle to make him sick.
Mr. Bravo is ill. Will you come? Mrs. Bravo, will you get up? Mr. Bravo's ill.
What?
Is Mr. Bravo?
Oh, isn't it?
I don't know, Mum, but he seems very ill. Charlie, wake up. Charlie, what have you done? I can't wake him up.
Oh, no. No, Charlie. No, Charlie. No. No. No.
I must tell him. Florence, what did you do?
His water bottle.
What?
The powder.
What powder?
Griffiths gave me.
Griffiths gave you? Why?
Alexander's drink in Malvern. Fanny got it from him to stop Alexander drinking. It made him sick. There wasn't much left in the packet. I did it before to stop Charlie wanting to, forcing me to. It was to stop him, like Alexander's drinking. Why did he drink it all? He never did before. I didn't think how much it was.
You didn't know what you were doing. I must tell him.
No!
I have to tell him.
No.
He may be dying. We cannot let him die.
Suppose he does.
Then I will tell him. He told me that he had taken poison. He will not remember what he said. I must tell him he's had poison. Do you know what it was?
Only a little. It never harmed him. It only made him sick.
What was it?
To keep him from my bed, I had to do it. I couldn't bear another miscarriage. You know that's true. Oh, Charlie. Oh, oh. Why did you do it, Charlie? Why did you leave me? There's no need. Why did you leave me? Why? You made me do it. You must. No, you must. No, no, not tonight, Charlie. No, Charlie, leave me alone, Charlie. No, not tonight, Charlie. You hurt me. No, leave me alone.
all gone. No. Someone should hear me. Gentle Jesus, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Say. Pray me!
Only 2 years had passed. The inquest was at Southsea, where she had gone under the name of Mrs. Turner. She died, they said, of drink. Her parents brought her back to Buscott and buried her in the family vault, here in this churchyard. The church where she had married Alexander when she was just 19. She was 33, but there is no inscription for her on the stone. The Campbells sold their house and left her. No more were buried here to keep her company. The grave is a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Poor Florrie. She has her peace at last.